Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 17 of the Hammer Territory podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you deep in the night here on a Wednesday evening into Thursday. We are almost at the end of the month of May. And of course, this podcast is part of the Foul Territory Network. Subscribe to the show anywhere you might find your podcasts. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, Overcast, and again, anywhere you might find podcasts. Also recommend checking out the latest show on our podcast feed from Sean Coleman and Stephen Tolbert on Tuesday evening into Wednesday, talking all things Ronald Acuña, etc. A good conversation there, as always, from Sean and Stephen. I'll have more later on this week as well on this podcast feed, but something of a mini pod today, as I am still waiting for my usual co-host, Scott Coleman, to return from his never-ending European journey. But I promise you, he'll be back in the near future, and he will not be subjected to me too often in solo fashion. But it is late. There was some news that happened late tonight, so I went solo as a result of all of that stuff. But for one thing, at the top of the show, barring an emergency podcast between now and the end of this week that we probably don't want because emergency podcasts in May are generally not good news, this is going to be the last time that I personally podcast about the Braves in the month of May. And I would say good riddance to that. After a 7-2 loss tonight to Washington at home on this Wednesday, the Braves are now 12-13 in the month of May. And despite all of the team's overall success in the last several years, obviously repeated division titles, World Series, etc., the month of May has been a relative house of horrors for the Braves. That's been referenced on this podcast in different ways in the last couple of weeks, I'm sure. But just for some numbers here, again, 12-13 this month in 2024. Last year in 2023, it was their worst month of the year. They're 15-14 in the month of May. So similar to this year. The previous year, they were 13-15 in the month of May of 2022. In 2021, famously, they were not very good for a long time before getting super hot and winning the World Series. But they were 13-12 in the month of May. And then it was even their second worst month in 2019. So pre-pandemic, all of those things. So long story short, for whatever reason, and it might be variance, it might have something to do with something and whatever, and I'm not saying that it's definitely going to fix itself. It's not. You should never assume the Braves are going to suddenly be awesome again when the calendar flips to June. But for whatever reason, in the last several years, May has been the nadir of the Braves, and that's been the case so far this season. With that said, they lost the game this evening, but there was a lot to talk about because of the debut of Spencer Schwellenbach. So we found out on Tuesday afternoon, basically, that the Braves were going to eventually call up Schwellenbach. And it had to do with all kinds of things. But the news broke before they could actually make that move. The move ended up happening on Wednesday, and they optioned Jimmy Herget to the minors. I recommend listening to the show that I did with Garrett Spain of Battery Power and Peach State Prospects about 10 days ago now on this same podcast feed. That's a good conversation about the minor leagues in general. I will always say this, if you're a new listener, I am not a minor league expert. Neither is Scott, to be honest with you. But we always want to be up to date to some extent on minor league stuff because it definitely matters. This is certainly a team that is in win now mode, so it's not quite the emphasis that it was around the team like it was during the rebuild when we started the podcast 7-8 years ago. But still very relevant, and Garrett's an expert on that. So we talked about a lot of different guys, but that included Schwellenbach, and he was very high on his potential on that podcast. For some more background, Schwellenbach is a second-round pick from 3 years ago, 2021. He'll actually be 24 later on this week in terms of age. He's a top 3 or 4 guy in the system, by all accounts. People that are smarter than I am, and he's regarded as a guy who's quite polished and major league ready, despite the fact that he was coming from Double-A before this. He had Tommy John actually right after he got drafted, so he's only thrown 65 total pro innings before this year. So definitely keeping an eye on his workload is probably a good idea. And the Braves are probably doing that so far. So as a spoiler alert, he looked pretty good tonight. I don't know if he'll be able to stick in the rotation and pitch the rest of the year, even if it goes well, because again, that innings, I won't say cap, but certainly they're going to be careful with him after not throwing a ton of innings in a long time. But he started high A this year. Made 6 good starts there. They made 2 starts in Mississippi at Double-A, and was completely dominant at the Double-A level. 13 innings, scoreless, looked fantastic. He became only the 24th player in the franchise history to go from Mississippi to Atlanta. And by the way, the last 4 guys to do that were Vaughn Grissom, Michael Harris, Max Fried, and Dansby Swanson. Not a bad list. So tonight, he threw 5 innings. The first 4 of them were scoreless. In the first, he went 1-2-3 on 11 pitches, looked fantastic through this disgusting slider for a strikeout. He got out of a jam in the second inning, that in pretty impressive fashion. He pitched very well. And then he got basically. In the fifth inning by Lane Thomas, he probably stayed in the game a little bit too long. Of course, this is sort of that never-ending philosophical argument that people want to have that I'm not going to do right now necessarily about times through the order and whether you want to be more proactive than reactive. Everyone's always on different sides of this. I get that about whether a guy needs to like kind of show it or have some trouble before he comes out of the game. But it was fairly foreseeable, in my opinion. I don't know, my guy Steven Tolbert was tweeting about this in real time on social media, of course, about the third time through the order being kind of maybe a danger zone for Schwellenbach. He looked good until that home run. And even that I would say not even just the home run. That inning, he was a little bit shakier. But regardless, he looked good, did his job and more in this game. He certainly showed a lot more than some of these other spot start options have shown in the last couple of years, whether it's Winans or Vines or Dodd or whatever. He has a big fastball. He averaged about 96 miles an hour tonight with the fastball. Very solid there. And pretty much a wipeout slider. He had a couple of really nasty ones in this game. That's always been the rep that he has by all accounts from what I have seen and read about and talked to people about behind the scenes. He got 11 swings and misses in this game. The slider was popping, I think. And in general, he looked the part of a guy that you are not afraid to call up. And again, I think that it's worth keeping in mind that, yes, he jumped from AA, but essentially from what I had heard, he was maybe the most ready guy when it came to the pitching prospects that were not like the 4A guys, not your Vines, Winans types, but the lower end guys. People were asking why it wasn't Waldrop, for instance. And Waldrop's a lot more famous, first round pick. I think the consensus is that he has more upside from what I have seen and heard. But obviously the Braves, I think Garrett got into this a lot with me 10 days ago on the show. But basically the Braves are trying to work some stuff out with Waldrop. It's not that he can't pitch the majors right now. It's that they're not trying to rush him along too much. This does not mean that they believe Schwellenbach is a better prospect than Waldrop. It means that they wanted him to start in this game. That's all it means. There's always this rush to be ordering guys or whatever, and he was in the top 3, I think, for pipeline and battery power, et cetera. Like, he's a highly regarded player, but there was some surprise because he's not like a big name right now if you're not a prospect sicko. But I thought he looked really good in this game. We'll get into kind of the more of the fallout from this game in a second, but that was kind of the top line thought of this one, is that it was a maddening loss. They didn't play very well. The offense, as we'll get into in a second, has not been good at all this year for the Braves, at least since the first couple of weeks of the season. That continued tonight, as we'll talk about in a second. But the top line story, I believe, even with a loss, is that the Braves might have found something in Schwellenbach. I'm not going to get over my skis here. I'm not going to tell you that he's going to suddenly be in that spot all year long, or that he's going to be this, messiah figure coming back to save the rotation. Number one, the rotation's been awesome for most of the season. But number two, it's one start. But when you talk about a guy with that pedigree, he looked the part. And yeah, Washington's offense, not fantastic, not an awful offense necessarily this year. So I would say if you're looking for a positive from tonight, and there aren't that many from a loss at home, that was a positive start from Schwellenbach. And we'll see if he makes another start the next time around. In a second, we'll get into more of the offensive stuff. But first, a little break to hear from our partners on the podcast. All right, some other stuff from the game on this Wednesday. They were down 3-1, and the Nats got a 2-out, 2-run single on a literal checked swing. And I think, again, everyone's ready for May to be over. That was one of those signs in that moment. It didn't change the game necessarily, but it was kind of funny and maddening and one of those can't predict ball things. I also have a stat for you, and I know Steven and Sean mentioned it yesterday, but now it's even more extreme. Steven tweeted this out tonight. The Braves, of course, as I mentioned before, are 12-13 in the month of May. In the 12 wins, they have allowed 2 runs or fewer in all of them. All of them. They're 12-0 when allowed 2 runs or fewer in the month of May. In the 13 losses, they've allowed 3 runs or more in all 13. And they are 0-13 while allowing 3 runs or more. That is crazy in its synergy. It makes sense, given that while it wasn't the way this team is built, they have been essentially cruising along, or not necessarily cruising along, but staying afloat is probably the better word choice, because the pitching has been so good for the most part this month. Offensively, they have performed worse than a 12-13 team, but they pitched so well, and that's a great way to put it. Obviously, it's a little bit convenient that it's literally 0-13 versus 12-0, but that's just one way, again, to kind of point out how good they've been pitching-wise and how bad they've been offensively. There you go. In this game, they were pretty miserable offensively again. They had no walks in this game. The top 4 lineup was actually just fine. They had 6 hits out of the 4 of them, including all 3 of their extra base hits in this game. But the bottom five of the lineup went 2 of 19 at the plate. I've talked a lot about the top of the order guys being an issue all year long. And by the way, that is still true. I'm not saying otherwise. The loss of Ronnie does matter, of course. And the Braves unequivocally need guys like Riley and Olsen in particular, their other stars who are remaining, to be stars. And so far this year, they've not been stars. Olsen's showing some signs. Riley's been hurt, all that stuff. They've not been what they need to be moving forward. With that said, the bottom of the order has been wretched for a long time now. For instance, Michael Harris and Orlando Arcia, who are usually in the bottom half of the lineup. I know that Harris is going to probably lead off some right now because of the way that that's all breaking down. But Harris and Arcia both have OPSs under 550 in the last 30 days. Pretty rough. Obviously, there's been games where it's been Chadwick Trump. He won't play a lot right now because Murphy's back. That's good. But the bottom of the order has not been, in fact, it's been worse than the top of the order. So that's just something to keep in mind. I have to give the caveat here that offense is going to rise. It always does during the course of the season across the league, I mean. Temperatures get warmer, the ball carries further. That's how it works. But offense is way down across the league this year, which is a good part of context around the Braves. Now, does that explain everything? Definitely not. But, for instance, last year in the league averaged 4.62 runs per game. This year is 4.31. That's a pretty big drop-off. Home runs are way down as well. Last year was 1.21 per game. This year it's 1.03 per game. And by the way, that's the lowest per game figure in home runs since 2013. That's a long time. League-wide OPS is now 697. That's down from 734 last year. It hasn't been below 700 for a full season since 1989. And again, it's probably going to go up, but really, really rough. But the counterpoint is, and look, I'm not going to do this discussion all the way here either, but every time the Braves have a rough game on offense, everyone wants to point out, not everyone, a lot of people want to point out the strikeouts, right? It's this never-ending debate as well about putting the ball in play and small ball, all those things. Strikeouts are actually down across baseball this year, while offense is down. You would think that less strikeouts mean more offense. Not the case. So every time, and without fail, someone, whether it's me or Steven or Sean or Scott or somebody else around the Braves, tweets out something about hard hit balls or exit velocity or batted ball profiles or whatever. Or tonight, for example, if there's a excuse me 2-run hit by the opponent, there's always people in the mentions talking about, it's obviously exit velocity doesn't mean anything. Whatever, put it to the side. But there is this year an inverse relationship. Strikeouts are down, offense is also down. Keep that in mind. But anyway, I'm saying that to say offense across the league is down. That might impact the Braves. Like, there's been lots of talk about the balls, batted balls in particular. Like, they're not juiced up right now. And given that the Braves are, I won't say reliant, but they are certainly a power-focused group. We saw that last year. They might be impacted a little bit more. Again, not an excuse. You still have to produce. And they have guys in this lineup that certainly had not produced this year. But I feel like it's probably been a little bit under-discussed how the lack of power across the league might have bitten the Braves a little bit more as far as the conditions are concerned than the rest of the league. Anyway, that's all I have for the game itself. From there is some news and notes to get to before we get out of here. So the one newsy item, I would say, is that the Braves signed Ramon Laureano. He signed a minor league deal. He's now going to be in Gwinnett. About to be 30 years old. He was once quite good as a outfielder in Oakland, along with Sean Murphy, old pal. He had a 4-win season in 2019. He was a reasonable player last year, about a 1-win player, according to Fangraphs. This year, he was bad in about 31 games for Cleveland, and he was waived. But there were some positive comments made by Brian Snicker about Laureano. I'm not saying it's going to change your life, but a guy like that for free on a minor league deal makes some sense, especially in the wake of the Ronnie news. I talked about it a lot on the last show that I did with Grant, as well as the Emergency podcast. But it seems like, and so did Sean and Steven, it seems like the Braves are going to roll with this Kelenic, Harris, Duvall outfield for a while. And that's not a shock, nor should it be. I think Kelenic and Duvall are both like reasonable starting outfielders. At this point in time, always reasonable guys to throw out there. I'm always behind Duvall. Kelenic, I always get the appeal of him, etc. But if it doesn't work, you want options. And Laureano may be nothing. He may just wash out and be gone. But if they can find something in him that, again, he's not old at this point. He's still 29. He was really good, like as of 2 or 3 years ago. So just a guy that you take a low-cost flyer on, basically a no-cost flyer on, no-risk flyer on. And if it works, it works. And that would be pretty impressive and very, very helpful, I would say, if it were to come together. One more note here on the non-news front, but also kind of topical. Dan Szymborski of Fangraphs, who also created Zips, which is a famous and I think very good projection system. He wrote a few interesting things in the last couple of days about how the Braves project without Ronald Acuña and how they compare to the Phillies in particular. His numbers basically saw the Braves have about like a 10% dip in their division odds just by taking Ronnie out of the lineup, which isn't a huge surprise. Ronnie is excellent. It might be a 3, 4, 5 win dip, depending on what you were projecting, just by taking him out of the lineup. Dan also published a projected standings update as of Wednesday, and that had the Braves finishing 4 games back of the Phillies at the end of the year. Granted, that would have meant at that point in time that the Braves would have still been better than the Phillies the rest of the season, even without Ronnie, because the Braves were, at the time of the simulation, 5 games back. So they would have only been marginally better than the Phillies, but better the rest of the way. But obviously, the deficit matters. We're talking about 2 months of baseball. At the end of May, yes, it's still early in the season, but it matters that you're now 6 games back as I'm recording this podcast. So it would make them a better team, but it's notable in itself, even without Acuña, that the projections and the betting market in particular have also now swung pretty solidly to Philadelphia when it comes to the division. Now, does that matter? You could argue either way. That was not necessarily the case a few days ago, though. Even with the Braves behind the division, yes, the odds have changed this preseason because in the spring, the Braves were huge favorites to win the division, with good reason. It had narrowed, but now I would say the combination of the weak play this week so far, and also the Acuña injury, more importantly, things have leveled off a little bit, and now the Braves are the underdog for the first time in a while in the division. Now, it remains early, and I should have to remind anyone listening to this podcast, if you're a Braves fan, a Braves sicko, found the show, first of all, thank you for being here, subscribe to the podcast, but also the Braves have had some comebacks, especially the one notable one against the Mets where they were down a big margin, came back and won the division. So it's early. Philly's been playing great baseball, but just want to keep that in mind. Every once in a while, I'll check in with some projections, and to the surprise of no one, the systems like the Braves less now than they did a few days ago because Ronnie's no longer there. But also the division deficit is 6 games as we're heading towards the month of June, and that is notable to me and nothing else. Last thing, a brief look ahead to the game on Thursday. For one thing, the Braves are playing a game on Thursday that's a night game, despite it being a getaway game for Washington. That's often a day game. I'm not sure what the quirk is there. I'm not saying it's never a night game, but that's one that I thought was interesting. It's a 7:20 game in Atlanta. But there was a little bit of a surprise. As I'm recording this podcast, happened a little bit about an hour ago, and now it's midnight or so. But the Braves are going to start Ray Kerr on Thursday instead of Ronaldo Lopez. So immediately the question was, is something wrong with Ronaldo Lopez? The answer is no. According to Justin Toscano of the AJC, he confirmed quickly that Lopez is healthy. There's no issue with Ronaldo Lopez whatsoever. So it's going to be very interesting to see why that is. But I think logically, from what the beat guys have said, and beyond that, it's going to be pretty logical, I think. So Lopez has only pitched on 4 days rest. So exactly 4 days rest once this year. And it would have been a second time this time. People hate this, and I understand that. But Lopez has not thrown more than 66 innings in a season since 2019. He's been a reliever for a long time now. It makes all the logical sense in the world for the Braves to take it easy on Ronaldo Lopez. Even more so than Chris Sale, who's always had injury issues. But workloads matter. And I know there's this theme always about guys just throw out there until they're whatever. But being proactive on a guy who's been awesome so far this year makes sense. Ray Kerr was in the bullpen on Wednesday in case it seemed that Schwellenbach might blow up and have a short outing. And if that had been the case, they would have used Kerr and probably started Lopez tomorrow or done something else. But they seemingly like Kerr as a potential starter. And I know he was not very good in his last outing, and I saw some of the reactions to that. It's one start. I'm not going to tell you he's good because I don't know yet about Ray Kerr as a starter. But I have personally no issue at all pushing Ronaldo back a day, having him be on extra rest as much as possible. He was never going to throw 200 innings this year. That's not what's going to happen. There's no reason why he would have. And if they think that this is the best course of action to handle him, he's been really good so far, so no complaints. Does that mean they're going to do this all the time? I don't know. Maybe we'll get more information, but they did not announce this until after they were already kind of done for the night. So there wasn't like Snit talking about this. He'll talk about it on Thursday. And I'm sure Sean and Steven will talk about that more on their next show. But that's why that happened, you would imagine. And there you go. The Braves are also facing the Nationals again. They're throwing Trevor Williams in the game. He's been just kind of a guy in his career, but he was pretty brutal last year. He has been very good this year, however. He actually has a 2.29 ERA in 10 starts. Pretty strong peripherals. So Kerr versus Williams, tough spot for the Braves, you would imagine, in some respects. But I will say the Braves are still, I believe, favored as I'm looking at this podcast. As I'm recording the podcast, I'm looking at the odds page as we're talking right now to make sure that I'm right, but I believe that I am. Yes, the Braves are still favored pretty solidly in the game according to the betting market. So does that mean they're going to win? No, but it does mean that even with a suboptimal pitching matchup, the Braves are seen as favorites in the game on Thursday. One more note before we get out of here. Owen Murphy, one of the Braves prospects, is having Tommy John. That's a little bit of a brutal news, so unfortunate stuff there. I don't have much analysis there. It just kind of stinks. Obviously, for anybody to have Tommy John, you never want to have that, but Murphy's a guy who's certainly one of the more prominent prospects that the Braves have in terms of name anyway. First round pick in 2022, for instance. So there's that. We'll have more on that in the future, I'm sure. And, that's all I have for the most part on today's podcast. So big picture, a nice debut for Schwellenbach. The offense is still maddening. We've done so much on that, and we'll probably do more in the future, but it's been frustrating to be sure. And then Ramon Laureano, and there you go. So that's all I have on this mini podcast. Please subscribe to this show. I know we say it all the time, and every podcast tells you to subscribe. I'll be the first to admit that, but it really does wonders for us if you would subscribe and auto-download the show on your podcast platform of choice, whether it be Apple or Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Casts. We should be anywhere. If we're not, let us know. We'll get that fixed as soon as we possibly can as the part of the Foul Territory Network. But thank you for listening to the show. We really do appreciate that for sure. Ratings and reviews, definitely appreciated. Listen to the ads, support our sponsors. That's also huge. And please, please, please do us a favor and tell your friends about the podcast. We're trying to get in front of some new people as much as possible. That's the nature of the business, of course. But hopefully you have someone in your life that's a Braves fan that's not found us yet, and it would be a huge favor to us if you would go ahead and do that. So thank you for listening to the podcast. Hopefully next time you hear my voice, it'll be alongside my guy, Scott Coleman, as he returns from his never-ending journey. But in the meantime, you will definitely hear from Sean and Steven in between then and now. Probably, at least that's the plan at this point in time. So stay tuned, subscribe to the show. We'll see you all next time.